In the next set of videos, I'm going to be talking about three different ways in which political scientists characterize or assess democracy in the United States. Some say that what we have in the United States is best characterized as majoritarian democracy. Some argue that what we have is democratic elitism, and others argue that what we have could best be characterized as pluralist democracy. In highlighting all three of them, I'm not suggesting to you that one is right and the other are wrong. To the contrary, I would suggest to you that there's probably an element of truth in each one of them, but that's really for you to be the judge. So first, let's talk about this notion of majoritarian democracy. The fundamental idea behind this, and that what political science argues, is that public policy tends to reflect the preferences of the majority of citizens. Now, proponents of this idea of majoritarian democracy don't argue that as soon as the public is in favor of one thing, policy changes. It's more accurately, it could be suggested that public policy reflects the preferences of a majority of citizens if those opinions are stable over time. If the public holds a strong view on something over time, eventually the government will adopt the policy that the public wants. And it's pretty clear why that might happen, because if those policies don't get adopted and the majority want them, they'll vote government leaders out of office and put people who are going to adopt those kind of policies. So that's the general idea. And then as a corollary to that, is the idea that when public opinion changes on an issue, there's a tendency for a corresponding change in public policy to follow. That the government is in fact responsive when public opinion changes. But again, not that it changes quickly, but that it does eventually change. Now, the story is complicated a little bit by the fact that we have a federalist system in the United States. That is, we have the federal government and we have the state governments. And there are certain things that fall under the purview of the federal government and certain things that fall under the purview of the state government. And so sometimes policy will change at the state level, where at the federal level it stays stagnant. And so what I'm about to talk about is an example of that. And so majoritarian democracy, it's sort of happening at the state level, it's happening at the federal level, and it makes it a more nuanced picture, but one that I think will make sense. The graph you're looking at there, right on the screen, is from Gallup. Gallup is a polling agency, and it shows U.S. support for legal same-sex marriage from 1996 to 2020. The question that they ask on this survey, and although the wording changes between 1996 and 2006, but we're not going to focus on that, but we'll come back to it later in a different lecture. The question they ask is, do you think marriages between same-sex couples should or should not be recognized by the law as valid with the same rights as traditional marriages? Okay, so essentially, should same-sex marriages be recognized and be accorded the same rights as traditional marriages? And if you look to the far left of the graph, in 1996, 68% of the public said that they should not be recognized valid or with the same rights as 68% said that it should not be recognized as valid with the same rights as traditional marriages. Only 27% thought that they should be recognized and as valid and given the same rights as traditional marriages. So 68 not valid, 27% valid. Now, if you look to the far right of this graph, you'll see that it's basically completely reversed. In 2020, when Gallup asked this question, 67% said that the marriages should be valid, and only 31% said that they should not be. So here's a good test for the proponents of majoritarian democracy. They would argue that if you see changes in preferences like this, government policy should follow. And in fact, in many ways, that's exactly what happened. Now, you don't need to remember the details of all this, so I want you to understand the general concept. In 1996, the federal government passed a law called the Defense of Marriage Act. The Defense of Marriage Act is a federal law that stated that for the federal government, for the purposes of the federal government, they would only recognize marriages between a man and a woman. They would not recognize marriages between same-sex couples. During that same year, a state court in Hawaii had ruled that they couldn't find any reason why same-sex couples should be prohibited from marrying, that there was no reason to treat same-sex couples differently than traditional couples. Now, they didn't make same-sex marriage legal in Hawaii because they figured that their decision was going to be appealed up to the Supreme Court, and they didn't want to allow people to get married and then have those laws invalidated, or those marriages invalidated. And so they did what's called stayed their decision and let the courts handle it. As a result of the decision in Hawaii, what happened is states responded by changing their constitutions to state specifically that their states would only recognize same-sex marriage. It happened in 1998, it happened in 2000, happened in 2002. States started changing their constitutions to make it perfectly clear that within their state, the way they define marriage, their states only recognize marriage between a man and a woman. But around the 2000s, things started to change. And as you can see, public opinion is getting closer. Massachusetts, for example, was the first state to permit same-sex marriage. In San Francisco, the mayor of the city at that point in time allowed the city officials to start issuing same-sex marriage licenses. The mayor at the time was Gavin Newsom. On the other hand, 5 states passed laws specifically stating that their states only recognize same-sex marriage, a marriage between a man and a woman. Then around 2008, 2010, you start to see a shift. And more states start permitting same-sex marriage. In California had passed Proposition 8, which said that California would only recognize marriage between a man and a woman, but the courts in California ruled that law unconstitutional, and same-sex marriage became legal in California. The shift happened where by 2014, 90% of the public of the American people lived in states where same-sex marriage was permitted. And around that same time, the Supreme Court made an important decision in which they declared that prohibitions against same-sex marriage were unconstitutional. And so what happened is exactly what the proponents of majoritarian democracy said would happen, right? First, things started to change at the state level. And so policy started changing at the state level. Eventually, policies changed at the federal level as well. It happened through a court decision, but it happened at the federal level. Public policy tends to reflect the preferences of the majority of citizens. That's exactly what happened, and that's what proponents of majoritarian democracy are talking about. Here's another example, really quickly. America's views on legalizing marijuana. In this poll, it's also done by Gallup, also done in 2020. On the far left, you can see in 1972, only 16% of the public thought that marijuana should be legal, right? The question they're asking, by the way, is do you think the use of marijuana should be made legal or not, right? So it looks like 15% in 1972 thought they should be legal. By 2020, 68% said it should be legal. So what does this show? Well, at the state level, right around 2000, a bunch of states started passing laws making medicinal marijuana legal. It just kept growing and growing and growing. By 2014, I think in 2014 alone, 14 states made medicinal marijuana legal. And so the number of states that allowed medicinal marijuana to be legal was growing and growing and growing. Around 2012, states started making recreational marijuana legal. And I think on this graph, I don't display it, but by the time we get to 2020, like 14 states had made recreational marijuana legal. Now, I don't know how many it'll be at the time that you're watching this video, but my guess is that more and more states are going to continue to make marijuana legal either medicinally or recreationally. But at the federal level, that hasn't changed. In 1970, the Congress passed the Controlled Substance Act. And in that Controlled Substance Act, it identified marijuana as a Schedule 1 drug. What that means is that the drug has considered to be, there's a high potential for abuse, and it has no medicinal value. Although there's been a dramatic change in public opinion, as you can see, from 1970 to 2020, marijuana at the federal level is still considered to be a Schedule 1 drug, and it is still not legal at the federal level. Well, does this mean the proponents of majoritarian democracy are wrong? No, not necessarily, because the argument was never that the public policy will change as soon as the public does. It says policy will change eventually when public opinion changes. And so I'm going to make a prediction here. My prediction is that in the coming years, one of the things that's going to happen at the federal level is what happened at the state level. You're going to see laws start to be passed at the federal level that are probably the first step will be to make it legal at the federal level for research organizations to look at the medicinal value of marijuana. Right now, they can't even do research on marijuana because it's a Schedule 1 drug. Eventually, you're going to see that change. My guess is that in a few years' time, you're going to see medicinal marijuana being allowed at the federal level, and then ultimately marijuana being legal at the federal level as well. There's no way for me to know if that's accurate. If it's changed, by the time you're watching this video, I'm going to sound like a genius. If there's been no change, well, then you can call into question the proponents of majoritarian democracy, and you can also call into question my predictive powers as a political scientist. But that's the way it would work. So again, majoritarian democracy is the idea that public policy will reflect the preferences of the majority, but not immediately, because we have a complex political system, but that eventually public policy reflects what the majority wants.